Yeah.
Thank you everybody so much for coming along this evening to the Bunker Gallery. We're audioing this evening, so not videoing it. So I may have to explain just so we get that clear on the audio. Thank you for coming along to the Bunker Gallery to sit amongst my ghost sculptures and be, I suppose, witness to a conversation with myself, Lisa Traxler, and a very dear fellow artist, Jonathan Parsons. And what we've decided we're going to do this evening is just talk about the works, how they were formed, where they came from, all sorts of things. So what I'm just going to give you is a little moment about Jonathan, very, very dear artist friend. So Jonathan is known for the diversity of his practice, which includes installation, sculpture, found objects, drawing, painting and fabrication. He was selected for the British Art Show 5 in 2000 and was one of the youngest artists to be included in the Notorious Sensations exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts in 1997, which toured on to Berlin and New York. He co-curated Seeing Round Corners for Turner Contemporary in Margate in 2016, which attracted more than 1,500 visitors.
150,000.
150,000. that was
It was more than 1,500.
50.
A bit more.
That was just to check your list. And amongst many other things. So please do check out his website because his work's amazing. And he has also been following my work for many years. I knew I'd get the numbers wrong. He's been following my work for many years. So I hope between us we'll make an interesting conversation for you guys to listen to.
Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here and to come and see you in the studio and to talk about the work and to hopefully try and pick out a few threads that are interesting for everyone to understand a little bit more about what we're seeing here. So the show is called Blast Wall.
Yes.
I've just got this thing where I used to be able to just look down at my notes, and I can't do this anymore. So I have to do this. So hopefully it will make sense. I'm interested in this title, Blast Wall, and it's obviously, I've got written down here that everything comes from the bunker. And could you tell us a little bit about what actually the blast wall is?
So let's go to the words itself. So blast wall. So a blast wall is a barrier designed to protect vulnerable buildings or other structures and the people inside them from the effects of a nearby explosion, whether caused by industrial accident, military action or terrorism.
So we're in a bunker that's been designed to resist military action.
Yeah.
And I think we've got this kind of twin wall behind us. There's this wall here, and then there's a secondary wall outside, which creates this amazing space that we walk through.
Yeah.
And I don't know, but is this to do with the fact that the outer wall is a sort of, it dampens the blast or what?
So that will take, this is a World War II radar bunker, and the structure was built in about 1941 to 42. And so its blast wall, as you say, it's its echo wall, which is beyond this one. And that would have been there to take the impact of anything that would have happened to it, like an explosion or anything happening. So that was the front line. So that took all the impact. So you would hope then that everything in here and us sitting here would be completely safe. Because that would take it, all that wall, it would be the, you know, I'm going to take it.
So at the time when you first came here and you were revealing this structure that had been completely overgrown and you were restoring it and cleaning it and starting to work on the build of the house, I think the first thing you did was restore and make good what we think of Nissen huts, but actually called craft huts. specific sort of wartime architecture. You first of all made the huts habitable, so you work in there.
Yeah, that was
while
really
the build was happening
yeah.
here.
It was the fact, for the practical reasons of we both, Lincoln, my husband and myself, both needed to carry on with our work. He's an architect, I'm an artist, so it was a case of we need to keep having functioning studios. They were completely derelict, so they were done up first so that we could get on with the day job as the build was happening. And in a way, I suppose those craft huts were almost a godsend as well to have them on site. So
it's amazing that there's two. There's two of you, and there's
there was originally 3. So where some of the cars are parked, there was a third hut, but it was very, very badly damaged. So we used that one to patch up the other 2.
Oh, brilliant! So you had parts, spare parts.
Yeah. So you tried to keep everything, all the materials, as similar as possible.
So while all the sort of chaos and mud of a new build was happening up here, you were furthest away possible down there in the studio. And what was it that you were working on the studio at the time?
So that would be my retreat. So we have done a house build before, so I knew what was coming at us, and that's a very fast train, and it's very strong, and it's got a lot of impact. So to be able to deal with that, we knew that we needed to function our studios, which we did, and then I knew that my studio then would be my place of safety and my place that I could retreat to and make sense of what was happening up here amongst the mudslick. So that's where I would go to, and once I closed the door of my studio, that was my space then where I could just try and make sense of everything that was going on.
I think you were working, you sort of became interested in an aspect of the bunker, which was the fact that you'd found these almost like archaeological remains of a structure that was stretched across the...
Yeah, so this was interesting. So we realised that around the perimeter of the bunker was dug this trench, which was filled in with very rough concrete, and every now and then the blocks would be all underground, so every now and then the blocks, so it would be a line of concrete, then a block and another line, and the blocks were to hold down I'd like to say the word clasp, but they were a lot stronger than that.
Big old cables.
Yeah, big cables. So, and we get very high winds here when the weather's sort of really doing its thing. So it had to be something that was going to hold down and be very secure. And what we found out through talking to other people and research that it was cloaked in a form of camouflage over the top, which straight away you sort of think, oh, what is that? It couldn't have been fabric, or could it be? We later found out it was a metal mesh camouflage, which cloaked the top of the bunker. But I didn't know that at the time, so
amazing.
I went off to the Imperial War Museum to do a bit of research and to try and discover what was this amazing place that we had in our back garden, as it were. What was happening? And
I think that led you on to sort of stumble across or discover at the Imperial War Museum these dazzle camouflage battleships from World War I.
Which probably practically everyone in this room is probably aware of, that I became completely and absolutely obsessed with dazzle. As I went to do my research, I was looking into all sorts of forms of all forms of camouflage, and so there was a lot of that there to kind of get my teeth into. And during some of the days I was down there at the Imperial War Museum in the library, I'd go down to the cafe to have a coffee and before I carried on, and it was probably the first or second trip I was down there. I remember standing in front of this glass cabinet, and it was full of glass shelves full of all these little model ships, very crudely made, but painted with this incredible geometric design all around them. And I just read the label, and it mentioned the word camouflage, so straight away my sort of antennae went to that, and I zoned in, and that was the whole...
And they were artist designed originally, so there's this kind of aesthetic quality to them.
Absolutely.
I think that led on to a show you did at Southampton City Art Gallery.
Yes. So, well, the show at Southampton City Art Gallery, it had a sort of sister show at St Barb in Lymington First, which was to do with a lot of the history of dazzle and camouflage on the ships. So dazzle basically was painted on the side of ships, merchant ships and military ships, during the First World War, and it was, so you can imagine these amazing, I couldn't believe the audacity of dazzle in a way, because you imagine these massive ships
The size of building.
The size of building. They're out in the ocean, and what they were doing, where they were trying to scupper the U-boats basically. So they were trying to either by the speed that they were going at, or the direction they were going at, or whether there were one or two. So this dazzle sort of confused all of those points. Really.
Did it actually work? Was it just an idea that was just amazing? Some artist thought, well, there's a vehicle the size of a building, let's just paint it.
Well, he obviously did a good talk. This was Norman Wilkinson who came up, and he was a marine artist. So, I mean, he obviously had a good line of chat because it was taken on, and thousands of ships were dazzled. Then it went across to the States, and they did the same thing.
Everyone just thought, this is the thing that's got to be done.
And I think if you can imagine that coming into a port somewhere, the morale must have been boosted, because you see this amazing. But they were just so beautifully contemporary. Yeah. When you just look at them now.
Well, you think of what I always think about with that sort of design eye, that sort of feel, is the World War I artists. You know, the Christopher Levinson's exploding shell. You know, these incredible angular compositions that sort of bring in the depiction of things, but also a high degree of abstraction as well. So it comes from somewhere else.
Well, if you also think, I suppose, if you think of the timeline of it as well, you're thinking of Cubism and Vorticism. You know,
British variety.
You've just got so much then that expanded from it. I don't know if it was a zeitgeist, it was something that was just around.
Well, the cataclysm of the First World War really, galvanised artists around the world. You have Dada coming out of that. And things like that. So that Southampton show is related to the print over there called Industry.
So that print is called Industry, and Industry was the first dazzle design that Norman Wilkinson came up with.
It was called Industry.
It was called Industry. That was his first one. And painted on at HMS Industry, and that was the first one that happened. Right, so that's how that came about. So when I was invited to do the wall mural at Southampton City Art Gallery.
So this print here is a version of the mural you did at Southampton.
So we're looking at this. It's a black outline basically that I painted onto it was actually 3 walls of Southampton City Art Gallery. Across the whole space from floor to ceiling. So it was almost as if you were by the side of a vessel of some sort, which was quite amazing.
So you had a sort of building-sized painting.
Yeah, straight onto the wall.
That echoed a sort of building-sized vehicle.
Yeah, so that was the idea.
Nice.
And then alongside it, you were invited to put on a cloak, which was then painted in a dazzle.
Oh yes, you were just
and stand in front and just see if you could then disrupt whoever was viewing you.
Well, I've seen those on, where is that? Where have I seen that? On Instagram or something?
Yeah.
People are kind of disappearing against this wall.
It's quite
camouflaging themselves just with the dazzle. So it definitely breaks up the outline, doesn't it?
Yes.
That's certainly something.
So you're not quite sure what you're looking at and what's going on.
Yeah.
So that was the idea. And then when that show ended, obviously like all gallery shows, everything gets taken out of the gallery, so they painted over the wall, and a lot of people said to me, oh no, they've painted over, taken that painting out, and I was like, but yeah, okay, that may be the case, but with the dazzle ships, once they had done their military life, they were all painted back, their livery went back to what they would have been beforehand, so all that dazzle was painted out. So I like to think of it as a similar, so what I did was the print that we see on the wall here, the Industry print, is a direct representation of what would have gone onto the wall. I wanted something that was tangible, that I had to be in the timeline of my work, so I had this print made.
It's lovely. I quite like the idea of doing a sort of ephemeral piece of work, or like a temporary wall painting or something, and the action of when it's coloured out is actually can be quite thrilling. Sort of destroying something.
It was so purposeful. It was exactly right for what it needed to be. So I had no quite. It was just it needed to be that way, and that was just right. Yeah. Absolutely.
And so, how does that relate to a show that was planned at Key Arts? It was called Dazzle and Disrupt.
Yeah, Dazzle and Disrupt. So with fellow artist Jeannie Driver and the amazing and incredible curator Georgia Newman. So we started, I suppose, Georgia had seen the shows, the Dazzle shows, and then we sort of had chat a bit of Georgia's idea to sort of come up with this. but we needed some funding, so we went to Arts Council to try and get funding for this.
Yeah.
And it was a long process, as these things are. But meanwhile, we sort of stayed on it, and we just kept talking about how it was going to go. And then we finally got the funding, which was just, it was so brilliant because it had been such a long project to get to that point. And so all the emails, we've got the funding, we can go for it. And so Jeannie and I just hit the floor running because we didn't have very long to produce the work. And just, I think in the first or second week or very soon after, we all got Boris's message.
So this was early 2020.
Yeah.
It was all about to happen.
Yeah.
It was a dazzling, disrupt, two-person show.
It certainly disrupted.
It was all on the. It was all on track.
It was all on track to
and
be.
in early
to be based on
2020,
yeah.
it's all about to happen. And
Yeah.
then, like
so
everyone,
it got stopped in its tracks, and everything got suspended like it was hanging in the air. So I think, and nobody really, obviously, as everyone knows, nobody really knew what the outcome was going to be and where we could continue.
but you were in the middle of making the work.
Yeah, I started, yes.
So this is examples of the piece that's in the alcove over there, and of course the 3 sculptures that are in the blast wall space.
Outside that people have been able to see just
So that's those ones.
yeah, so those are the ones I was working towards. The little one, you know, in the alcove here, and these are part of that whole.
So that's
that whole
for the
area.
show Dazzle and Disrupt, and it very much follows on from the imagery in the print,
Yeah.
in sculptural form.
It was dissecting that, so it was actually how could I take elements of work from something previously and bring it through to the next body of work, but with meaning and intelligence, so it had some impact. And so it was a case of taking that wall painting and then dissecting it and arranging. So above you we've got these fragments. They're called fragment, and these are drawings from that actual industry print that I was just working out how could I dissect and start playing with them in space, and then these became the 3-dimensional time travellers that are outside.
And what you're doing is then, this is a specific shape that's cut out, in this case, of plywood, isn't it?
Yeah.
Poplar ply.
Yeah.
And then slotted together to create the sculptural
create
form.
sculpture.
So this was all ready to go, wasn't it?
Well,
The lockdown, that had been, hello. You enjoying the talk, my dear? Was that all ready to go then in sort of March 2020?
No,
was
no,
it
not
sort
at
of
all.
in the middle of being made, or what?
well, what had happened was I was dissecting the industry print, and I was taking that to AJ Wells to do some enamel and steel. It's okay. So I was doing a wall. I was doing a wall sculpture from that, and then of course everything stopped and halted.
Yeah.
So when we went into lockdown, it gave me a chance to look at what was going on.
So you'd made an enamel wall
piece. I'd started
piece.
it. I hadn't finished.
So it's in the middle of that.
Yeah, so that had started. So
That was similar
yes,
in
those
form
shapes.
to these.
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah.
Okay.
So that was the sort of, I suppose, the piece that went in between, which I haven't shown this evening in this show because I needed to just pick what was right for him. So, but during that first lockdown, that's when I started playing with the shapes, and also that was when the whole idea of being able to take the paintings off the wall and make them into a 3-dimensional painting. So basically I see them as 3-dimensional paintings. So you walk around them, you view them.
There's quite an interesting, the way the pieces out in the blast wall there are made, it's quite an interesting process because you've got 3 layers of the ply, haven't you? You've got front and back.
Yeah, poplar ply.
And a sandwich piece in the middle that's part of the construction. So how did you approach the painting part of it? Because in the past you've made painting panels, you've made shaped panels that have had particular bits of painting on them, and those have come out of small maquettes and they've been enlarged.
Yes.
How did you approach the sort of way of applying the paint for those pieces out there?
So that evolved through the quiet of lockdown. I was very fortunate to have a peaceful lockdown so that I was able to really focus on what was. I know it wasn't like that for everybody, but for me it meant I could really contemplate what I was trying to do, and it became a very powerful time for that because I was so focused on what was happening. So
everything outside
it just stopped.
is, you know, before you were down in the craft huts, the Nissan hut, with the chaos of the sort of mud slick up here and finding solace in the camouflage ships. And then all the chaos of what was going on in the world outside, but here there's a sort of calm, still
sense of peace, I suppose.
Sort of almost like a precinct, you know, the sort of the area where the house is.
So I started doing some small, maquettes, but usually small versions. So I started building these small versions, and luckily I'd been to see a company on the island before lockdown. It just happened to be timely, because I had an idea that I wanted to work with some different materials. A lot of my work works with various materials, so it's looking at like enamel steel, wood, you know, sort of paper. It's all various things that I'm interested in. So I'd been to see this company before lockdown, and they did all this laser cut and CNC cut, and so I was quite interested in how I could work with them as a fabrication agent, I guess, for me. So over lockdown, I was able to make smaller pieces, which they were still operating, so I was able to send them CAD drawings and sketches and ideas of what I wanted, and they were able to then cut and do things, leave it at the back of the factory, so I actually never got to meet them until like months and months later. And so therefore that's how I formed the Time Traveller, which the pieces
So these are the pieces that were in the Dazzle and Destruct.
Which started as small, you know, like the size of these. So how could I paint on these?
So those are the kinds of forms that you were having cut out.
So that's the forerunner.
And outside they're coloured before they're cut out, I think.
Before they're cut,
So you've got this sheet of material that you're painting on.
Yes. So
how does that work?
This is how I realised I could do it. So there was a set of painted ones of these. So they became very important, because then, as lockdown proceeded, and there we were, I knew I had something here. How could I scale up then? Because I knew that the Dazzle show was going into the West Gallery at Key Arts. It's a massive gallery space. It needed something that was really going to be powerful. It needed that impact. It needed to dazzle. It needed something. So it was, how can I scale up? I'd perfected these, and that was through a lot of work with the smaller ones, and they were so important.
That's just the solid colour.
And then to scale up. So I worked out, and there was a lot of maths here. I know I'm not very good at numbers, but there was a lot of maths and there was a lot of working out on how can I make this so that when it stands in the space, it fills that space, but the scale has to articulate itself correctly with its width as well as its length and diameter, all parts of it.
The thickness of the material.
So you have to get that right, otherwise it's not going to look right at all. So what I worked out was, and this actually came from the house build and from working with Link, the architect, was the fact that all these materials come in certain sizes, so panel sizes, and they come in certain sizes because they have to be produced, they have to get on the back of a lorry, they have to get through doors, they have to. So then builders, architects, designers know how to work, because you've got a set of figures that you can work towards. So I took that. So we live
our life by the standard sizes.
So standards. So obviously talking to the fabrication people, I knew what size my panels were going to be. It was great, and I do this when I work with AJ Wells with enamel and steel. I know what size the steel panels are. So that gives me almost like a blueprint to work on. So there's my sheet of paper, as it were. How am I going to fill that sheet of paper, which is the panel? So I made the Time Traveller sculptures fit on to this panel in a certain way, so that the wastage was minimal, but also that then I could articulate what was front and back, what was centre, just the whole sort of principle of how they were going to be. And it was really exciting. So I couldn't paint them down in my studio because the panels were too big. They were 2.5 metres by 1.5.
So 244 by 122 centimetres is the standard size of panel that we all live by these days.
For that particular poplar, or you know, whatever that one is. So I brought them in here into the bunker, and it's the first time I painted in here. And it was really exciting because obviously this space is, I call it the room of requirement in here. So for this evening's purposes,
for Potter fans.
So it's it's whatever it needs to be.
So whenever you go in the room, it is what it needs to be.
So I painted in there. So I set up trestles because I wanted to paint 2 panels at once. So you've got 5 metres of painting happening at once. I mean, it's for a painter, it's an absolute joy.
Lisa, do you want to explain where it was?
Oh, the setting up. So I set up, so the trestles were all set up where you guys are sitting on that back wall there, because I was trying to catch the light, the best light I could. And it was a case of, once they'd been painted, to swing them. I mean, they're quite hefty things, but I just had to swing them round across the room and stack them up here.
So
And I
you
had
were,
my paints along here.
painting, because there's two sides to each painting, to each sculpture, so you were painting in that
Each
tandem.
time, yeah, that's it.
So you basically, it went from there with a small gap that you could get round
just
all
walk
the way.
Yeah.
So it was
That's how long it
a
was.
long trestle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it was just 12 metres of painting going on, but in a way that it was so exciting. It was just such a joy to paint on that scale. And so what I did was I painted them the way I would paint something in my studio that was on an easel or on the floor, because that's how I usually paint. So I don't work it out. I knew what my colour palette was. It was quite limited. I'd worked that out, but I didn't work out what the design was going to be.
Yeah, so it's just making the painting.
Yeah,
on
it had
those
to,
walls.
yes, it had to be informing. One piece had to
And
inform
so you've
the
got
next and the next.
one face, the other face,
Yeah.
and there's a sandwich thing which is not
Yeah,
coloured.
between.
A third layer of that same material.
Yeah.
And so then your design, your fragments, is superimposed over those paintings.
Well,
Those paintings are cut out
yes.
into shapes.
So the shape then of the maquette, for example, which has then become the drawing, the CAD drawing, is then cut with the with the laser machine in the factory. So once the panels have been painted,
So
they go
there's
to the
almost a
factory.
kind of there's an element of chance coming in here, sort of
absolutely.
randomness of that. You've got quite specific shapes for the painting that you've developed. You've got very specific shapes for the sculptural elements, and then those come together, and whatever happens, happens, does it?
And I really like that because if I haven't got my painting being spontaneous, and then the way it's laid on the sheet and cut being spontaneous, it's so rigid, because everything else has to work in that factory. Otherwise, it's a hell of a lot of money, and it's just a wasted opportunity. So I know at certain points I play with the maquette, I play with the colour, I'm playing with the painting. Because if you take that away, everything can be so rigid, and then I lose interest. So I need that spontaneity.
So that process has gone through, and then what, they just deliver the results back here?
So then everything's put together, and then they come back for finishing back to me here. And it's not really until they're back here and all finished that then they get slotted together.
Wow.
And you just see if
You
that
finally
painting,
see
well, you see if the
what we
painting
see out
works
there.
in 3 dimensions. So the first time, I actually go to the factory the first time because we'd opened, I think it was a bit of between a lockdown, and I asked if we could just put one together from the bench. Yeah, they took it off. And it was just, and it was in all the confusion of the factory, so it was really busy and really, but I knew that something kind of interesting was happening.
amazing. And then, still you hadn't been able to install a key arts.
No, so the show, so we all kept going with the show, and everyone was really brilliant and patient, and we all kept going for it, and we decided that it needed to be, it was March the 27th, so we actually physically installed in the West Gallery, so that was it wasn't just sort of photographs that was taken somewhere, it was physically installed in the West Gallery, because I did a wall mural on the walls, on 2 of the walls, and the time travellers went through the centre of the gallery space.
But still not open till public.
And not open. So then Georgia Newman did loads of interviews with myself and Jeannie, the other artist. So we did interviews online. We had a lot of walkthroughs, talking, lots of interaction that the public could actually see and I think more people saw it than perhaps wouldn't have done. And then it opened in April, I think towards the end of April. So it was open physically for people to physically go for about a month after that. So I think we managed to get audiences from far and wide. And it was
amazing.
Really, I mean,
it's incredible how being forced to work in a different way actually changes and develops how audiences can view things.
It was
That's
incredible.
happened with theatre, it's happened with all sorts of other art forms, but you were right in the middle of that.
Oh, it worked amazingly. There was a 3D walkthrough you could do, so you could actually get onto the Key Arts website, and I think you could still find it there. And so all these facilities, and this was all obviously coordinated with Georgia and myself and Jeannie. So it was just really exciting, and just have that culmination. And I think, you know, all the work was made during that lockdown, so suddenly then to present it to an audience was quite, I know that usually is how an artist works, so it wasn't so different, but it was quite extraordinary.
Everyone else's circumstances are different, aren't they? We're all
maybe we were all looking at
dealing
it
with it in a different way.
in a different way, so yeah.
So you learn an enormous amount about these materials
Yes.
and how to
And the
approach
production.
it and the sequence of things that needed to be done. And this led on to the next sort of
Yes.
set of work.
So then that was almost the blueprint then of the next show, which is Blast Wall, which is this main body of work that we've got in the bunker gallery at the moment, which are the 6 upright, tall painted sculptures, and then the wall pieces that are hanging sort of surrounding it.
And you talked about, let's talk about the upright pieces here first, which are called Ghost, these freestanding sculptures, they're called ghosts. Was that something to do with the bunker and the blast wall?
Yes,
Where they came from?
completely. So okay, so I had a show, I'd been talking to a gallery for a number of years, and I had a show booked in for 21, so earlier this year, in May 2021. And
so this is the Foundry Gallery.
yes, this is the Foundry Gallery
in London.
Chelsea, in London. And so what I found quite interesting was the space of the gallery in London is pretty much exactly on the same footing as the blast wall out there.
So the space out there where the
same
plinth is with the
size.
fruit.
Yeah, same size. So
Brilliant.
that was quite an interesting.
Sounds
But
good.
also because we were going in and out of lockdowns, it was just, everything was quite confusing as well. So the background for the ghost sculptures was the fact that we had this almost this incarceration. We all had to stay put. We couldn't go anywhere else, so we had to just sort of stay in our environment. So I suppose it was that idea of how important does my home become? What is my home? What is it asking of me? Is it the stuff around me, or is it the building, or is it how I feel about it? And we all went through this, wherever we were living. But I was very fortunate because every time I came downstairs in the morning, you know, to make my cup of tea or whatever for the day ahead, I would look straight down this blast wall, you know, this incredible piece of brutalist architecture that was sort of sitting in the landscape. And I suppose not leaving the site for many, many weeks, or it was months, I found myself actually utilising that space in the blast wall because it was such a peaceful space. You could almost forget anything else was going on outside. So
you said it's very still.
It's so still, and it's got such a tranquility to it. It's almost like I don't know. It's just got this incredible. You feel like your whole self can just be at one there, sitting there. So I would often sit there very quietly, and all this confusion going on, and I knew I had a whole show to get together,
You've
but that wasn't.
You've got these very powerful upright walls.
Yeah.
You've got the sort of squaring
Yeah.
of the floor and the lintels above.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then this incredible slanting sunlight that changes across the day.
So this
every
was
day. It was an amazing summer, wasn't it?
So this is what came forth from sitting there and being witness to that, was this sort of quite rigid, or there it was almost like a cloister that surrounded me, so it was a sense of safety. But the fact that it was very handmade, so you could see the pattern on the walls, you could see where it had been cast by hand and built by hand, so that was very important. And then also the fact that as the sun charted itself across the sky, you just got this amazing geometry that went on.
So there were in fact changing angles across.
Oh, completely. Just constantly, and so you almost felt like you could hold time. You felt you could just watch this time. You know, I had nowhere else to be, so what was I to do? And so I photographed it, and I became sort of obsessed with the shapes. You know, drawing in my sketchbook, just obsessed, like I'm some lunatic. You know, I just because there it was every day, and it was almost this grounding.
That's quite nice. That's a sort of the kind of rhythm of an artist's studio. That the daily practice of whatever it is.
But nothing else caught my eye, so I didn't get off.
So what did you come up here? Would you deliberately sort of
I was here
stay in there?
I mean, I was in my studio still because I was still just sort of doing maquettes and sort of things, but this was almost like I was drawn to this place. And
so you took the technical aspects, the way of making the time travel pieces that are outside.
Yes, yeah.
You took that method of making and applied it to a new set of works.
Yeah, I knew I wanted to work with that again because it was so exciting and it was quite a breakthrough. So what I did again was I knew I wanted these upright structures because I just wanted them to be in that space. They were upright. That's all I knew, that they had to be this form as opposed to the time.
When you're in there, there are these walls, and then there's the sky.
It's like this James Turrell or something where you just you're watching time pass. You know, you can sort of see the clouds and the movement of the sky. So it was you're almost reaching for that within that. So I knew that I wanted to use that process again that I've been working with before. So I knew my panel sizes. So go back to what do you know? You know your panel sizes.
244 by 122 centimetres.
What's my budget?
That's the constraint, you know. Work. It's very. I think it's always very important with, as a creative practitioner, to sort of have this idea of working within the constraints, sort of embracing the boundaries of things.
Because you can either look at it as this is going to compress me and make me stilted, or you can push against it and go, these are my boundaries. So what can I do within this? It's almost like what madness can I create within these boundaries? And it's quite nice to have the boundaries because actually otherwise what is it? You could go on forever. So it was a really great thing to have that form that I could work with.
So you're looking at this whole sheet, and you're thinking about how to cut it up.
Well, at the same time the sheet was like almost this sheet of paper, isn't it? Well, my panel, so that's what that is, and material. So I knew what the material was going to be. That's quite important because I think working in 3 dimensions, it's like, what is your material? Because what's going to give you the answer to what you're trying to create? So I knew that my material was going to be that. It wasn't going to be enamel and steel or something else because I wanted to paint on it. So that was the one. That was the other part. The other part is I knew where they were going, so I knew I had to fill a space.
So you had that.
So I had to have a certain amount.
Dimension of the space.
Yeah. Because if you just do one of them, it could be of the right impact, but actually where they were going, it wasn't so. You know, I knew the dimensions of that, so I worked with that. And then also you've got your budget. So there's great. I can just go crazy.
So there's more than one set of limitations. There's quite a few. There's always these constraints.
Yeah, and I think you've got to take that into account because otherwise you can think, what am I going to do? So I started thinking, right, okay, I'm going to do 8 boards. I'm going to paint that, make them. And I started doing maquettes. So I'm working on the flat, but I'm also thinking 3D at the same time.
What did you work with first? You made maquettes first.
First was being out there and witnessing what was happening. So that was the shape. So those shapes were forming. So that was the important bit. So the looking bit, the being in or the feeling bit, the real sense of that. And then through that feeling, I started cutting the maquettes in card, which is almost like, for me, like sketching.
Hand making.
Yeah, just hand cutting. So I had
sketching in 3D.
in the studio.
So there's cutting out the shapes and fitting them together and deciding what you think works.
Yes, but very crudely because I hadn't kind of quite formed it all yet.
Sure.
And then at the same time also realising that I had my panel size. So how was that going to sort of work with these cutout shapes? Because so you can start free-forming your cutout shapes and then you can sort of apply them to your panels, but they may be, you know,
you've got to get back to the constraints of the panel.
So that was always going back to that.
So there was a kind of dialogue between the kind of forms you wanted to see in space and actually how they're going to be made.
Yeah. And so in the excitement I thought, okay, I'm going to do 8 panels because out of 8 panels I could roughly do this many, you know, I was trying to kind of, and then I started doing my sums as well, so you're still looking at your budget at the same time as all the others and realising that I'm not going to be able to afford that. I'm going to have to sort of try and where can I work with my numbers to.
So when you've got these 7 panels, for example.
So it went to 7 panels rather than 8. Yeah.
When you've got those, are you thinking, right, this panel can be cut up and made into sculptures? Is that how it works?
What I wanted to do with those particular panels was get the most out of them as possible, so as little waste as possible, and use maximum, but for the right reasons. So I've got a sketch of one. Shall I show you that particular? Do you want to see that yet? The drawing
Yeah.
of one of the panels.
Yeah. So have a look at the full. Have a look at the drawing of the full sheet size of one of these sketches.
So this is why I don't know if anyone can see it. So this is why I'm thinking 3-dimensional. I'm also thinking 2-dimensionally with numbers, which is all a bit. So this started becoming my plans that I would just go to. So this was a scaled version of the
But
panel.
this isn't just one of these sculptures.
No. This is probably two parts of one, and then two of another, and then one, because each ghost is made up of 3 or 4 components, and each component has, for me not to go completely crazy, each component has a code on it.
Yeah.
So that code is on each of those. It's
But
actually,
you're envisioning the 3-dimensional final thing.
whilst I'm doing it, 2-dimensional.
And they're cut out of 7 different panels,
Yeah.
and they're not all coming from one panel. They're coming in from all
Yes, so
different.
say panel D here may have some of the other panels or some of the other sheets,
Yeah.
because it's just how I could lay them
So
out.
how do you hold this all in your mind?
So for me, it's a bit like doing a garment. So
Yeah.
before doing what I do now, I was in the fashion industry. So my degree was in fashion and textiles. So for me to lay out pieces of a pattern to get the most out of a sheet of beautiful fabric, I'm going to make that work somehow. It has to be, you have to get your warp and weft and all of this sort of thing. So I suppose it brought in all of that, the capacity for making garments into that.
But
And this in a way is a 3-dimensional, there it is, it's a garment.
But I find that completely mind-boggling. It's like you're playing sort of 4-dimensional chess, sort of thinking about,
Yeah.
how these things are going to cut out, how one negative shape is the positive shape of something else, but that's actually 2 different sculptures, and then there's a smaller piece, and I think I've seen one of those drawings where it's all the little pieces in the middle are cut out, and
Yeah.
that's for all 6 sculptures
So
almost.
from the sheet that we're looking, this particular sheet, the bits with the cross sections, I mean there's quite a few, but these were my wastage, as it were.
Yeah.
So very little in the scheme of it really. I mean
Yeah.
it's sort of little slithers, and
So the bits that are shaded in are the
Yeah.
only waste bits.
which I will hope to down the line utilise in
Yeah.
some other artwork, but I don't know. Don't even ask me about that.
So
yet,
so what are they called, ghosts?
So ghosts were. I see these type of buildings, these defence structures, as ghosts in the landscape. They're very overlooked. They become, almost obsolete. So they're the ghosts, and also the ghosts. The ghost sculpture, I think, referenced very much the wall pieces, which we might talk about in a
We'll go
minute,
on to into a
because
second.
that was about, I suppose, human endeavour.
But they're very upright,
Mm.
and a human body is upright,
Yeah.
and you're talking about the sort of uprightness of the blast wall. Is that
Mm.
connected to you, maybe, being in this place?
I didn't think of it in that way. Particularly, but I think, yes, you could look at the...
We're all ghosts in the long run, aren't we?
Yeah, in the scheme of things,
You know.
in the timeline.
So maybe it's something to do with the transience of it. Was there a kind of background of, what? Because at the beginning of the pandemic, I personally felt, the lack of, the fear of the unknown, lack of knowledge about what was actually happening, what it meant. It was difficult to sort of get a handle on.
I think how I feel, I feel them actually rather than see them sometimes.
So it's about feeling.
So it's about feeling, but also the fact that they were very still, and they had to be very still, and they were just witness to so much that goes on around. This building's been standing and sitting very quietly, very ghost-like in the landscape for decades, and
Just silently.
it's just got that,
solidly
and so they had to have that
staying.
similar beat to them, that kind of, I was going to say the heartbeat, which is a human thing, but they had to hold that essence, they had to hold this, this genius loci, this thing that Paul Nash talks about, which is this spirit of place, which is not to do with ghosts, but it's to do with this feeling of what is within the walls of something, and how you feel when you enter that, or when you're surrounded by it.
Yeah. And you said to me that the title Ghosts, you knew it was right because it was it spontaneously
It
came
comes-
to you.
I often find with art pieces, if you don't have to dig and the word actually comes, it makes itself known very loudly in my head, so that it just, and the more I try and ignore it, it will just still be there. So I always know when the title needs to be what it is.
You sort of feel that's right.
Yeah.
And you also were saying that that period of time was strange because, you know, all of us, we visit this extraordinary place and experience it in the way we experience it. But you were in residence here, and the words in residence to an artist mean something specific. When you're an artist in residence, it's a particular project that there's a time limited and has a particular aim, maybe it's got particular funding or whatever. But you were in residence here, and the word that came up from that is that you were home. This is home.
Yeah, that was that. I think that was the importance of it, was
In the space rather than just visiting.
yeah. I think that thing of I didn't have to leave and think about it somewhere else and sketch and draw and then come back and visit and find that time to do it, because here it was, and it wasn't going away, and I couldn't leave it either because I wasn't allowed to. So I couldn't even sort of clear off for a few days to get relief. It was literally just constant aroundness of it.
Yeah, and during the same period of time, while you were in residence at home, there also was this extraordinary family history of something that was about yearning for home.
Yes, so this is the bit I find very when something isn't forced and it happens in a natural evolution, you know that something special might be kind of evolving. So at the time that I was watching time passing through the glass wall and sketching and just becoming familiar with that, obviously talking to family a lot on the phone because I couldn't see them. My parents aren't here, they're in London. So, and I remember talking to my dad about what I was doing here, and he knows how obsessed I am with this building and the whole history of it and stuff. So he was sorting stuff out at home, and he'd come across it was a stack of letters from my gran, so his mum, and he was tidying stuff up and said, I've just refound them. You know, they get lost in life, I suppose. And so we talked about them a bit, and he hadn't read them, and he hadn't really had much inkling of what was, you know, what they were about. He just knew that they were all letters written by my great-uncle to his sister during the Second World War. And my great-uncle was posted overseas to Burma, and he was in the Kohima War. And he spent many years over there. And he was a prolific writer, so he wrote a lot of letters, and these letters survived. And he wrote so endearingly to his sister. They were so beautiful. And so my dad was chatting on the phone, and I said, have you read them? And he said, no, they're still in the box and stuff. And I just said, no, I'd love to see them. There was something about the fact that it was family, it was the fact that it had come from my dad's home, the fact that they'd been refound, and we were in this situation where I think we were all yearning to see our families and each other.
Yeah, this is like in the middle of 2020.
Yeah, so it all became... So he sent them, got them to me, and so what started then was this amazing kind of journey of discovery with these letters.
So at this moment, you're in the middle of your four-dimensional chest trying to work out
yeah, I was doing
how to
those.
cut all these things out. Are you painting the panels at the same similar sort of time?
I think well, it was interesting because that drawing happens the same time that I'm talking with the factory about the panels, so they can deliver the panels to me and I can start painting them.
Yeah.
Whilst this is the finalising of this, so it was all kind of kicking off at once. So
you've got a lot in your brain already.
I think my brain was actually aching, like I could feel it aching.
I'm not
like
surprised.
seriously aching.
You know, trying to work it out from the outside is quite a
And I'm sure Link was probably here to deal with it as well. So I would do that during the day, that was sort of that part of it, and then the painting. And then in the evening at night I would go upstairs and just sit very quietly and take each letter, and they were all kind of crumpled somewhere in an envelope somewhere, and they were, you know, just stacked in no particular order. And I'd take each letter and I started transcribing them so that I could have a clear run of what was being written, I guess. I mean, he wrote beautifully, my great uncle. He wrote absolutely beautifully, but the lettering is quite sort of curvature, so you have to look really carefully at each word. You can't just be flippant and go, oh, that's that, because it's not. You have to read again, and so then I was
taking your time over these letters.
I do maybe
deciphering them fully and
properly,
transcribing.
and then so then typing them all up so that I had proper. And And
So you
then
had a serious old workload.
it was fabulous though,
Amazing.
because I didn't know these existed, and they were to do with me. They were to do with my family, and I suppose because everything else was suspended, it was like, I can have this time to do this, and this is really important. And the more I transcribed them, the more I got to know this person that I never knew. So I almost felt like my great uncle was there, just talking to me, because he wrote in a way. He wrote in such a, some people don't do it, but some people do. He wrote in such a way that you felt like he was talking to you, so you could hear it in the room.
Amazing.
And so maybe I'd do one letter an evening, or it might take me a bit longer, because if he gave any information about family or stuff that was happening, war stuff, I would look it up and try and find out what he was talking about.
Yeah.
Or, so I was getting this sort of education whilst, about all sorts of things about, World War II stuff. And
And
he didn't talk about the horrors. This is the thing. He didn't talk about that, because what would you say? So what he did talk about was he sort of veered in on his genius loci, which was home and his spirit place, and he talked about home so much, the domesticity of it, and just the ordinariness, and Chuckle the dog behind the ear, and how's my sister, and just stuff that we would talk to each other about. But every
so
time,
a little bit like lockdown,
yeah,
we were all yearning for just
something.
ordinary, simple,
just simple things.
simple pleasures of life.
Ordinary stuff. But every time, what did kind of really sort of resonate with me was every time he wrote the word home, he used a capital H, so that he's almost sort of placing his home, this special place of home, into this higher-ness, this somewhere pure and beautiful and hopeful,
And
because
the tragedy, of course, is he didn't come home.
so he never came back. But what was beautiful about that whole situation, I think, was my dad was able to get in touch with his cousin, and my dad's cousin was actually my great uncle's daughter that was born when he was still away, so he never got to meet her. And I was able to send her the letters with the transcription afterwards, and
Wow.
she just said she never knew the letters existed. I mean, it was so powerful and poignant. So she read these letters and she felt like she'd had a chat with her dad in a way.
So the voice of her dad that she didn't even
Yeah.
know.
No, she didn't know they were there.
Didn't
So
even know they were existing.
I just think something like that is really quite powerful, because especially when now, and the fact that to actually engage with those letters, you have to hold them and open them and read them, and so
Very
it's
tactile.
tactile. There's something which we don't have. Who writes letters? Who, it's just the whole thing. I mean, he was writing about, I've got a photo of, his little girl, and he said she's got lovely chubby cheeks, so he had photos of her, and he could yearn and he could hope that he would see
And
her.
so she from you could read about that.
Yeah,
For the
she
first
read
time
about
ever.
herself,
How old
yeah,
was she?
that her dad had written about her. She
Yeah.
would have been like, I don't know, 8 months old or a
And
few
so
months
how
old.
old was
or-
she when she read the information?
So she's in her late 70s now,
Incredible.
early 80s. So it was just that, to hear her dad talking about her, it was like,
That's
there you
incredible,
are.
isn't it? She
Dad.
didn't even know that
Mm.
existed.
And he was he was 27 when he died, so he was a young person, and
So this
so
affected
beautiful.
you deeply, and
It
you
was
wanted
so
to do
moving.
something about it. You wanted to
So
sort of,
moving.
I don't know,
But I
mark
knew
that in some way.
I knew straight away that it would dovetail into what was happening with Ghost. I knew that there was some connection because of the basically the historical one.
Yeah,
to
of
do with,
course, yeah.
Okay, the World War.
Yeah.
That was one of them. The other one was home. We were both talking about the same thing with our work. He was in his letters. We were both talking about our homes and how important that was to be.
Amazing timing of everything.
Yeah, the
isn't
whole
it?
thing. So I knew that it had to, but also I knew that I wanted it to be like something tactile about it, that because those letters had to be, you had to undo them. You had to look so
unfold
carefully,
them
and you look at, even just to trace a word that someone's written, you feel very close to someone when you can do that. It's you somehow. So I had to. How could I
sort of
interpret
process
this?
that in some way.
Yeah. How could this happen?
So how did it happen?
Well, what happened from it was the set of letters up on the wall called 20 letters.
So that's those pieces on this wall
The
on the
pieces
back
we've got
wall
up on the
there.
wall.
Yeah.
And But what I did know is I didn't want to go back to a factory setting to produce them. I really wanted to produce something that I could produce in my studio by myself. You know, rather than share with the fabricators, which I had to do for the ghost.
So something that's a little bit more handmade,
yeah,
a little bit more tactile, a bit like
yeah,
transcribing the letters.
yeah, it needed to be that.
themselves.
So the other thing as well is I had all the cut-out pieces that had come from the previous sculptures, which had been the Dazzle ones, which are the ones outside.
So
Time Traveller.
Littering
the floor of my studio.
So what was on that drawing as the sort of shaded areas,
Yeah.
the sort of voids, the cut-out voids? They weren't waste. You didn't throw them away. You
No.
kept them
Not from this set of sculptures, but
from
the previous.
from the ones that are outside, the
Yeah.
Dazzle ones outside.
So it's
They've got
like
these void shapes, these
Yes.
angular
yes,
shapes.
all of these shapes.
You've got a
So
stack of these in the studio.
because it's like, how can I, you know, it's like the wall mural. How do I move on from that and use it in my new set of work? How do I move on from that? And so
Yeah.
I wanted to use something from the Dazzle to this part of this project as well. So, and I had them in the studio, so I wanted to make use of them. But just as shapes, they were just intangible. They were just sort of, they were
And
almost
covered in paint as well.
well, they were
Colours,
covered in paint from the
all
previous
sorts of
project.
all sorts
So
of angles and shades.
yeah,
and
so I
fonts.
knew I needed to take them back to purity. So that took absolutely ages because there's many pieces, because there's the front and back because they were separate. So I had set up outside my studio. I was sanding them all, and it was size front and back. I was just covered in. It just went on and on.
The sort of
for weeks.
projects people got up to in lockdown, where when you'd never do that otherwise, unless you have those enforced kind of blocks
Yeah,
of time.
because also I didn't know whether I was just wasting my time. I just didn't, and I'd been so.
No one knew what was going on.
No,
you know.
nobody knew what was going on. But the letters had been so important that I had to do them justice in a way. And but I almost had to forget about them to actually experiment with these pieces. So once I sanded everything back, I primed everything back to white. So that I basically had white
shapes.
White shapes, so pure form.
Yeah.
But I needed to ground them because they were just these, they were just lost. You couldn't put them together like that. So I came up with the idea of getting some cradle panels, which were to me like the pages of the letters.
So cradle panels are sort of traditional wooden
Like a
panels
painting.
that a painter would
Yeah.
use.
So if you look at the 20 letters, as their background, they've all got
a square.
Yes, so they all start with this where then I can hang off or play with on the surface the words and the shapes and the thoughts that these letters were.
You were saying it was a little
Making
bit
me
like
feel.
when you were transcribing, you were having to reconstitute some of the words, going back over the shapes, getting a context for some technical language you might have used,
So you're
and
constantly
remaking, and that making each one of the letters pieces was a little bit like, like reconstituting those words, like putting these things together. And of course, as you were saying before, like unfolding the letters and handling things, and it was hands-on in the studio. All of those things came together to make that.
So they had to look like you could play with them almost. You could just move these shapes around on the surface. So I had to make them
like
look...
the shapes of words almost.
Yeah, so that's it. So I had to make them
Sheets of paper and words.
look like that you could play with them almost. And so I had to construct them very carefully. And choose the colours very carefully. I limited the palette even less than the ghost.
So all of the work has a limited palette. You've got to.
Yeah, but I was reducing it even more for these, and the whole minimalness.
Well, where does that palette come from in the first instance? This reduced palette.
So the palette for ghosts and for 20 letters is, for me, it comes from my landscape here. It's very much this area of where I live. It's also very military, which why wouldn't it be?
It does have that sort of those kinds of ranges of tones.
Because what is camouflage usually anyway, when you've got it in certain places. But also, it's things like, okay, how do I explain it? I suppose it's things like, so through the ghost sculptures and on the wall pieces, you've got like this shot of yellow. So there's not a lot of it, but there's little moments of it. And that you could almost interpret that like military uniform with the lapel that's got embroidery in gold. So it could talk about that, but it could also talk about when I walk Susie, my dog, and at certain times of the year, especially along the coast, you get this beautiful bright yellow broom that just has this
flower
bud on it, and and it's so powerful again, but it works with all
Sort of
the other.
shines out.
So this needed little elements. So this is what, say for example, the yellow is that. But it's talking about, I mean, where we live here, you get the precipitation across the sea. I mean, that's constantly changing with the light. So it's subtle. You've got to do subtle tones. So they're not kind of like fierce, but they're soft.
So what's fascinating is that you've got this sort of almost industrial, hard-edged, abstract, almost, not quite violent, but it's got that overtone of war to it. But actually, at the same time, it's all about the subtlety of the sea and the sky and clouds changing, and the sort of fleeting nature of existence.
Yeah, being here.
So it all comes out of the bunker, and very luckily for us, it all comes back here, so we can enjoy it. Well, that's been absolutely amazing. I wonder if anyone has got any questions that they might want to ask Lisa after all of that.
Or is it honestly? I don't know. But yeah.
On the letters, some of them are dark and some of them seem a bit more cheerful. Did that have anything to do with the actual letter? Did you use was each letter then given a sculpture? And did you take the mood from the letter to reflect onto the sculpture piece?
Yeah, I understand what you're asking. No, because the letters were very much. No, I don't mean that as in like no, that's rubbish. But I think the letters were so powerful that they almost merged. So that when I was creating the artwork, I didn't want to be too specific because it needed to be almost this flow of consciousness when I was painting them. And I think if I tried to go, right, that's that letter, and he says that, then it would have stilted it too much, so I needed it to be a bit more expansive than that. But I understand what you're saying, but yeah, it didn't go that way. Yeah.
It's sort of like a whole big project, the transcription and everything.
Yeah, so it was, sorry Tommy, but I know what you're saying, because you could almost imagine that the more light-hearted could be the lighter ones, and then some that were a little bit more emotional could have been. But I think it was just the mixture of whatever was going on with them, and they were formed as such one complete piece. Yeah, I had to make that then as one big moment as well.
Well, I've run out of questions. So.
Thank God.
So unless anyone wants to ask another question, I suppose we can always have a chat.
We can always
informally afterwards.
Yeah. So, gosh, thank you everybody for just sort of listening and and thank you so much, Justin.
It's a great pleasure.
Because I had to, without being disrespectful, but I had to just be with you in this space to be able to talk. Otherwise, I've kind of, it just becomes more natural in a way to be able to do it that way. So thank you everybody.
Well, thank you so much.
Right, so thank you everyone so much. Just quickly, because I know everyone now needs to stretch their legs and whatever, we're doing a little bit of food and there's some more drinks, so please stay if you'd like to and you have time, because Link's been cooking away, he's pretty good. So if you do have time and you'd like to, you're more than welcome, because we're quite a sort of small group here. Also on the way through, we've left just some little leaflets and flyers that if you'd like to pick them up, and this is our next show that's actually happening in November, which is really exciting. And we have a painter for the next show, Marius, who's actually in the audience. So please, if you would like to, because it's got the dates when we're having that, so we'd love to welcome you back to something like that as well. But thanks, Jonathan.
You're welcome.
Yay.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, we can all come out this way, so I know.
I don't know how long
Yeah.
way, so we can see directly this way. I know, like.
Certainly not these, because there are red dots on those. And one disappeared because that went to the mainland, apparently. And some of them are
That was a really nice photo, wasn't it? She's also very and it is really interesting.
I was just noticing the way that they are like ink, and then there seems to be ink on yours. It's also incredibly creative. And now she goes in so many different directions. Very cool stuff. And the whole section that closes the structure, which started doing the web direction, I kind of wondered the only section with the when you look at these, you think, tried doing it after lovely as well. They weren't using discrete dots. So I thought, the same thing with something like this, you know, it's as simple as she would have done. She had me come to live here. You know, because
Oh, well, I
when we
remember
saw
how
her
it is
ride, it was a very different palette, wasn't it? When we saw her in the open place in ride, it was really different. Yes. Yes, that's right.
And you see the shadows, which make it but it does look like you can take it off. Move it. It's a good page. With the names. It is, yes, and it actually is. It was important to hear that.
Yes.
Because I didn't obviously get it. Yeah, I
It's
looked
been
it
a lot
up.
of that.
Yeah. I'm very impressed. I suppose it tells us something else.
My little one.
No one else thinks they're beautiful. And recently I've been to Wolverhampton.
Yes.
There was this big photograph and it's and I looked from a couple of years, so it's I find it very
All right, kids.
That's lovely, thank you.
Good.
Fantastic. It means so, we were just saying, it means so much more. When you understand, when you understand, when you